Hello everyone, it's Toby and welcome to today's little sketching video. We are of course sketching this scene, a loose landscape, well a loose seascape from Oban in Scotland by a fantastic sketcher. His name is Andrew and his profile on Unsplash is linked below. Now I want to show you this because I quite like it, but through this process we're going to start with watercolours and it feels scary. But I promise you this is a beginner friendly sketch. This is a sketch that anyone can do, anyone can learn to do quickly. And through that process we'll go from blank page to a little bit of madness to a really lovely finished sort of light filled semi-abstract landscape, which is just a joy to paint. Now with that I said we're using some basic supplies, so what are we using? Well, I have a piece of watercolor paper underneath all of this, which is 100% cotton and it's lightly textured. I'm going to use 2 or 3 brushes. So I've got a sword brush, but you could just use a flat brush. I've got a mop brush. This is a size 2. Both of these are travel brushes by Da Vinci, and both of them are synthetic as well. You don't need fancy natural brushes to create great art. Then I've got a size 6 round brush. This is a mixed synthetic and natural brush. It's got more of a point, so that's the difference between the mop, which has got a sort of fatter belly, and a round brush, which is more about having a nice point at the end. My watercolours are all here. I'll talk you through them as I'm using them, and you can check out my supplies link in the description to find out exactly which colours I've got. Last but not least, we've got a pen. This has got waterproof ink in, but actually with this technique you don't need waterproof ink because the ink comes at the end. And with that, let's start. Now the first thing you might notice is I've got a little sort of smudge on there. I just like to say it's not going to matter. At the end of this it will have faded into the distance. It just will not be something important, and it's really great just to be able to live with these little imperfections when we're sketching, because it means we don't have to throw away an expensive bit of paper. So with that little bit of reassurance, at least I reassured myself there, we can start. And the first step of this technique is to get lots of water, nice watery colours, and just paint the important shapes. I'm actually going to start by just painting them in water. So I've got this kind of distant mountain range. Get that shape in, and hopefully you can see the gloss of water there. I'm going to make sure there's lots of water on the page. We've then got this sort of closer set of cliffs, and get that sort of broad shape in. Now when we say shape, we're looking for the general ideas. We're not looking for perfection. We're just trying to get the idea of what's going on in this scene on the page. And that is where we can now start adding our colours. So look into that distance, and what do you feel? For me, I feel a sort of neutral, almost blue colour, and distant objects do come about as being a bit blue. So I'm going to start with a bit of cobalt, and look, in that wet watery sort of patch we can drop our watercolours and they'll paint themselves, as I like to say. So we don't need to spend a lot of time creating these varied washes, being too careful. If we've got the water there for us already, then certainly at the beginning of a sketch you can create a lot of magic just through this sort of process of wet on wet painting. At the top we've got this sort of gold and green bit, so I'm going to get a little bit of gold green, a little bit of quinacridone sienna, and just find these bright patches. Got some down here. Down here this patch is getting a bit more gold, so I'll go a bit more on the quinacridone gold. And then we've got everything else is either dark or black, so we can actually leave that because later on we'll come back and we will add those darker colours. Next, what else have we got? Well, we've got this lovely shape coming around the front here, haven't we? I'm actually going to swap now though to my mop brush, because this, instead of being a angular specific shape, which this mop lets us do, this sword brush lets us do with this fine point and flat edge. No, with this mop we can get this really big shape. And again, we just look and what kind of colour do we feel? It's quite a sandy brown, isn't it? That's the underlying colour. Now fortunately for me I've got something called Lunar Earth here, which will probably be quite a close match. It might be a little dark. The thing about watercolours is when you use more water, you get more of the white paper coming through, and so they become less dark. So hopefully, just using my lunar earth, I can get that feel coming forward. I'm going to try and vary this thing a little bit, like we did before. Here we did it wet on wet. Here, I'm starting wet on dry, that is putting my watercolors down, and then that's on a dry page. That's why it's wet on dry. But this time we've got wet on dry, and now I can add something different, and it's wet on wet. And I'm just going to add a little bit of quinacridone sienna and a tiny bit of indigo to that mix, and that will get us something a little bit murky. Well, it's not really changed too much, has it? Let's try again. A little bit more of those two colours, quinacridone sienna and indigo. There we go. We've got a slightly more murky feel to this front area. Just going to correct the shape at the back here to get more of that feel of the sea coming across. And we can move on to our next shape. One last thing actually that I'm going to add is just a few splashes, little splash of water here and there. You could even add salt, or you could press it down with a tissue, lift it with your brush, just something to get a little bit more life and texture into this sort of sandy area. Now we've got the sea moving back, haven't we? And the sea's got not a huge amount of value being darkness, being shadow. So we want to be quite gentle. I'm going to start with a little bit of blue. So I've got my murky blue up here I was using already. If we just water that down, we can see what it looks like if we just test it a little bit on here. And actually that's probably okay. But in there, I think there's also these little touches of turquoisey green. So again, as we come forward, remembering to leave white paper for those ideas of waves. As we come forward, I'm just going to change that wash, a little bit more turquoise here, even touching in a little bit of that gold green we've been using already. And then we'll get a little bit of these greeny hues coming through as well. And as we get closer, we've probably got a little bit more value, a bit more darkness, and we can get that in. Remember, still trying to leave some of these white areas so that we've got the idea of shadows into our scene. A few little splashes, a couple of splashes into our sand as well, just to balance out those colours. And we can move on to the last area. The last area, of course, being our sky. So I'm going to actually start the sky off with some splashes this time to keep it nice and loose. And I use similar colours to the sea, because the sea, of course, is mostly reflecting those colours we actually have in the sky. So loosely applying some more of these blues, less of the greens, but more of the blues, and just loosely applying them in those kind of shapes, again, leaving it nice and soft, not overdoing things. All this is the first layer of our colour. In a few places we get a bit more of these turquoises in just to give it that lift. Bring it round. I'm going to link up some of these shapes and let them blend and merge. We can always redefine things later. A couple more splashes in here to get just a bit more intensity, really. A bit more drama. A couple of splashes in here again. We can see what's happened with our texture. It's getting rather lovely. So with that, we've done our first layer. So we talked about shapes. Just remember we focused on these shapes here, this shape, this shape, this shape, and then a little bit of adding the background in as well. We need this to pretty well dry now so that we can come back in with a second layer of colours where we'll start focusing on shadows and bold colours. So here we are, we're mostly dry. Some of the sky's still wet, but that's fine because we're not really going to want to go back in and do anything else there. Instead, we're going to be focusing on the darker touches as we move forward in our scene. So what we're going to be using is similar colours, more intense. More intense in watercolour means, as we talked about before, basically less water. We said before, more water makes it lighter. Well, less water makes it higher saturation and a darker tone because we lose the white of the paper. So first, we've got these deeper tones going in the back. Again, it's still, for me, got that bluey, murky feel. So I'm going to go with a bit of cobalt and mix it into this sort of slightly murky stuff we were using earlier. Then a little bit of indigo just to dull it down even more. And with that, we can just come back in and we can do a redefining of what's going on back here. What we want to do is be nice and gentle, really. Create some of that texture, leave some of the light coming through, but also have a bit of just feel of that depth of things. And we're going to start by just negatively painting this forward cliff. So we come across and we negatively paint it. That means we paint around the shape that this forward cliff is going to form. And then we're going to move to that forward cliff. So we'll start again with those bright, lovely gold tones. We had a bit of quinacridone gold, a bit of handsy yellow before. Going to do the same. Oh no, so it was quinacridone gold and it was gold green before. So we're going to do the same mix again. And this time we're still focusing on those lovely sort of shapes. Again, leave some of that light, leave some of that underpainting poking through. But do find those key shapes. Key little shapes which just give a real picture of what's going on. We can find some of the deeper colours, deeper tones here. We've got some quinacridone sienna feeling warm browns over on this side and at the top here, and even a little bit coming down here. And some of this is frankly subjective. Some of this is me deciding what I think I see. So you can disagree. You can have a different sort of outlook on what exactly will make your painting look the best. And that's okay. That's why art is brilliant, because it's really not as objective as we sort of think it is. It's very subjective in how we decide what colours are important, what colours are even there at all. Coming forward, I've got these definite sort of dark region underneath, which is poking up into the light areas. If we just get that, and we can continue finding some of these other darks. So this is the second layer, is just defining those darkest areas and using that underpainting to provide the light. So we need to make sure we're leaving nice patches of light coming through. Still though, look at this consistency of paint. This is something people often ask me about. Look, it's not like toothpaste. It's still very, very much a watery consistency of paint. All I'm doing is just trying to suggest with watery, but lots of pigment, watery paint, suggest some of the key shapes. Got some lovely little greeny blues coming in at the side here. So I'm just going to mix my blue and my yellows and just find those deepish greens, which we can see up here, a little bit here, a little bit over here as well. Now a key technique to get your hands around for watercolours is the idea of softening edges. And all we do, we just dry off our wet our brush, dry it a little bit, which I'm just doing on my towel to the side, and then you come to these edges and let you just ruffle gently against them. And that way, do you see how suddenly this all comes to light? Now you can only do this if you've been painting with enough water. So a good way of knowing if you've been painting with enough water is if you're able to come in a minute or two later like this and soften or even lift. You can produce some light in the middle of the cliffs. We can produce like a glow from the sky by washing down as well. So as long as you're painting with enough water, you'll have the flexibility to produce these lovely watercolour effects, things which are unique to watercolours and just, frankly, for me, really fun, really enjoyable. Just create immediately sort of beautiful art. Going to soften just a couple of these edges as well, but I don't want to do too much there because it is its own sort of unique structure. Now, having let that all happen, we can come along and just find this key area. Just little bits of sort of bushes or shrubs or rocks perhaps coming up. Doesn't really matter exactly what they are. We just need to recognize that there are these shapes, recognize that they are dark, and then we get the idea of them into our scene. Just like that, I think we've done this bit. Don't want to keep going too much. I'm going to do a few little extra touches just to find a little bit more darkness. But remember, we've got one more stage to come of this paint, so we'll be able to add even more depth, even more darkness, even more definition in a moment. I talked at the beginning of this whole sort of second step about the idea of coming forward, so that's what we do next. We'll come forward to the next layer, and for me that's going to be back into this sand. Getting these lunar earth, bit of quinacridone colours again, and again we are looking to increase the sort of depth of tone in a few places. So here we can see in the back we've got like a patch which is deeper in tone. We've got a little black line running through which we can add in a second. And then coming forward we've got these sort of areas of ruffling. I don't know how to describe it properly. That's how it's feeling in my head anyway. These sort of deeper ruffling areas, and then little bits of light poking through as well. There we go. We want to leave these edges that define where the waves are getting to, and at those edges we can actually start to just define some of the shadows. A little touch of black will hopefully just define the shadows that happen where the water is overhanging. Just gives a little bit more definition to something which is quite abstract, quite challenging often to really feel like we can accurately paint. Then we'll get this little dark area just running through, and there we go. And last but not least, of course, we're back onto the water. Got our greeny turquoisey blue. So, and all we're doing again is finding some key shapes. So looking again, where are these sort of waves? Where are the slightly darker areas of water? Leaving plenty of white. Just getting a few more shapes into the sea. And it's going to be important here, again, to be coming back in a second and softening some things out so that we don't have all this excessively busy sort of feel going on. I think that's probably enough. Quite a nice abstract feel to the waves coming forward. Soften in, soften in. Remember, we're sketching, we're not trying to spend hours and hours today just really getting these exactly right. We're trying to work out what's a really quick, convenient and effective way of getting the important bits of this scene down. And for me, it's these kind of focuses on shape, focuses on the mood, focuses on just having a bit of fun with our processes and celebrating the watercolors for what they are. Can do a few splashes with that in mind. I think splashes are a really great way of enhancing the natural effects of our watercolors, enhancing the natural textures. So a few splashes in the key little textured areas, and that's the sand and the sea for me. And also just a couple of drops of some really bold colour that just while it's still a tiny bit wet, these bold colours hopefully will just blend and bleed enough that they produce a nice subtle effect, a nice subtle glow. Not too much though, not too much that they overwhelm, but just a nice subtle effect glowing into our cliffs and our other areas. And like that, that's step 2 done. That's our second layer of colours. Going to let this dry, and we're coming back in for the last 2 bits, which will be nice and quick. Firstly, our smallest brush, our darkest colours, and then a few touches of ink to really redefine our edges. And there we are, pretty much dry. Not perfectly dry, but dry enough for me. And dry enough and also wet enough that it will still feel fluid. What we're going to do is start with some really dark paint. So I've got a bit of indigo, quinacridone sienna. Now I really am almost at like a toothpastey thick paint. And this paint, problem with painting like this is that it will be difficult. If I get it wrong, if it's just clearly not right, this paint won't easily lift up. We're not very flexible. That's why we have all this flexible stuff going on underneath. And then we get to here and we can paint with some certainty, almost like we're drawing, but more focusing on shapes rather than lines, blocks of colour rather than outlines. This is where we really get that value. We really get that feeling of deep shadow. We really start to define all this madness which we've been sort of slowly progressing with the last 20 minutes. As we come up here, we can just define this edge a little better. We can find more light by outlining areas of light with contrasting black colours, dark colours, high value. Suddenly the light becomes much more obvious. It's important not to go too monotonic. So I'm changing my dark mix. I'm going from more quinacridone sienna, more indigo. And that just keeps things varied enough that it doesn't become boring. It doesn't become flat. We've got all this life coming up. So we don't want to lose that. Where we've got these little bits of really gorgeous light floating down, I know that they're not really there in the scene, but they are really lovely to me. So I'm going to just incorporate them into our scene. I'm going to pretend they are there. I'm not going to cover them up with high value. I'm going to treat them as part of the scene, part of this little sort of feature that we've got going on here, this big rock. Over this side, we see it's still wet, but that's great because it means I can get this softer sort of feel to my colours. They naturally will blend. Then we can just do little touches to suggest some of these shadows in some of these little mounds of rock. Coming forwards, we're actually pretty much going to stick with this same mix because we are focusing on these darkest areas. That will be things like this little black line. And I can see it's a bit too low in my scene, but it, it doesn't matter. Probably should be about here rather than down there. But that is the sort of natural risk, natural joy of painting quickly and wet on wet. Things will not be in exactly the right place. You'll have made errors of judgment as you were doing it, and you'll have to live with them and adapt. Like these amazing bits of light, we're adapting our scene, and actually that is also the joy of it, because I can't control it, and it works really well sometimes, things I couldn't have done on purpose. Just coming back up here, while things are still a little wet, I'm just going to soften some of these edges. I feel it looks a little overworked. Not disastrous by any means, I think it's working rather well, but just a little bit overworked. And often removing some hard edges, just softening things out, can just remove that feeling that things are overworked, overdone, oversketched. Same down here, having these little soft bits, these soft edges, really helps for me the feeling of detail but suggestion. Detail but not overworked, not overdone, not trying too hard. We've got lots of little blibs and blobs in here as well. Little sort of things sticking up as well, little funny shapes. We can just get that effect going with a few touches, a few splashes. I've got a few splashes in my sky. For me, that's okay. And I'll naturally, well, I'll do it now actually, naturally just add a few blues and things to counterbalance that and be able to bring that balance across the whole scene. In the background, probably all we want to do, tiny bit more, just tiny bit more sort of shadowing around some of these waves. Just suggest that little bit of shape. Suggest that these white areas we left aren't hollow but are in fact something real. Even just over here as well, we got like shadows forming under the peaks of waves. And this is, yes, an abstract way of representing them, but also I think for me it's quite clear that this is a beach scene, so it's still, abstract can still be real, abstract can still be very much representative of your scene. Couple of, I want to add a tiny bit more deep blue. I don't know why, I just I was looking around and thinking, maybe if we had just these few little more lines, it might just improve things about the perspective, showing how the waves are flowing in, and showing that this is more distant by getting those little lines closer together and less obvious. And there we go. So that is the colours now done. So we can wait for this to dry one more time, come back in with our ink and see what we finally make of it when we apply the darkest dark and this most little bits of structure. And there we are, pretty much dry, certainly dry enough to come in with my pen. Now this is a fountain pen, so as I'm drawing, it's going to be a little bit more absorbent, this paper, because the watercolours on it, because all the binders from the watercolour on it, the paper becomes more absorbent. So it's something to be aware of when you are sketching over watercolours like this, that actually your colours, your pen will be darker, it will be more absorbent, the lines will be bolder. And as long as you're aware of it, you can adapt. So I'm being more gentle and careful with my line making. I don't want to sort of spell out the whole scene. I want to neaten up some edges. I want to respond to my watercolours, but I don't want to tell the viewer everything. So I'm just using it sparingly around key shapes, highlighting points of contrast between light and dark, for example. Perhaps, for example, again, like in these rocks, we can now just show that there's little rock shapes by adding a few little pen lines. And these pen lines are, because they are the darkest thing here, they will add that last bit of shadow. Same in here, we can add just a few little textural lines. You leave that area for now, come forward and find just a few little dots, little dabs, just a few little finest sort of stones and bits going on. And this, if we just continued with our watercolours, we could have done this as well. We could use like a rigger brush or a size 2 round brush, something like that, and we'd be able to get these effects. It's just a cheat, really, a quick way of sketching using our our equipment, using our pen as a slightly different texture, a more definite kind of mark in our scene. And suddenly it's just a quicker way of doing it with a slightly different feel. But these same techniques, these same ideas are perfectly valid in sort of what I call real watercolor painting. What I mean by that is just, you know, when you just use your watercolors, when you don't come in, you don't sort of pollute it with some ink. But I do love the ink, and I more often use ink than not. As much as I'm making it sound like using ink is cheating and illegal, it's definitely not. It's a very valid way of creating art, especially for loose, quick sketches, for sketching on location, for making the most of the time. These techniques are absolutely brilliant. Just a little bit more of these sort of structured lines coming around to just show that there's a different texture here than the water. Couple of little black lines to reinforce these blue lines we added at the end. And I think we can pretty much call this one done. In fact, I'm definitely going to call it done. I think any more lines will start getting far too busy. And instead, I'll just pop my initials there. I'll hide my signature in the painting somewhere. Just my touch of fun. So there's like a little secret for me there. You know, if I ever gave this painting away or sold it, I'd be the only one to know where I'd hidden my signature. I always find something else to faff with as well. A couple more rocks in here. I think these rocks actually, I'm quite liking the busyness from these little dibs and dabs. But at some point we've got to stop. So I'm going to stop there. And I could always come back and add more tomorrow if I wanted. Add more splashes, add more ink. But we can't take away. So it's always better to stop when you're not sure what you're doing than to keep going. And like that, that's my scene, my Oban beach scene done. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you enjoy this technique, flipping around the normal process. Especially fun, I think, for lovely landscapes where everything is softer and more gentle. If you like this kind of technique, I have a specific workshop on it in my Advancing Colours course. You can find that on sketchloose.co.uk. Those courses there are super in-depth for all my techniques, looking at how I use colours, how I use my pens. So it's a sort of deep dive into my techniques and my teaching style as well. With that though, let's see in the next video. I'll link a few more direct colour videos like this in the blurb below. So have a look and I will see you there. So thank you everyone for watching my little sketching videos. If you enjoy my content, please do subscribe to my channel because it makes me really, really happy. Thanks again.